probably Humber Bay's last shipbuilder, and one of Toronto's great master shipbuilders was Hans Sachau. He was a naval shipbuilder and in fact built fair miles during the Second World War.
During the war, we built 9 fair miles, which were 110-foot, almost like the American patrol boats. They were used on the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast. We built 9 of those. He also built the largest wooden sailboat on the lake since the Griffin.
He built a huge sailboat called the Alvey, which was the largest sailboat that had been on Lake Ontario since LaSalle was there 260 years earlier.
And after the war, we did a few production boats, small sailboats and small cruisers again. We lived right on the lake shore, and at that time, in the early years, in the 40s, there were a lot of individual homes. The driveways were very long because the properties were long and narrow, so you couldn't really see very many of the houses. But gradually, a lot of those people turned their properties into originally cabins that people could rent. They used to come out from the city.
It was when people started thinking about camping. People could turn their properties into campgrounds, and it became sort of a campground era. And then people started putting up little cabins for people to rent. Always, it was the individual homeowners who had actually very deep lots who would build these structures on their own properties as a way to make extra money. Then if someone got the idea of joining all these cabins together, and the motel era came along. Always following, I guess, modes of transportation, because as people became more mobile, then car travel, a place to park your car, became more and more important. The first true motel to be built in Humber Bay was built by the Butwell family, and it was called the Shore Breeze. And interestingly, it was also one of the last 3 motels to survive in Humber Bay. The Shore Breeze was typical of the kinds of names that were used. There were actually eventually 33 properties across the south side of the lakeshore that had motels with names like the Cruise, Silver Moon, the Horseshoe, the Seahorse, Sunnyside, and so on.
Mother thought that it would be a good idea to have a coffee shop because there were motels all along the lake shore and there was no place for people to eat. So we converted part of the shop into a small coffee shop. We had a horseshoe bar and a couple of booths and started out by serving breakfast. But over time, it became something that we all really enjoyed. Mother in particular loved to cook, and we gradually enlarged it. We had 5 banquet rooms eventually, and part of the workshop that Father had used was converted into 24 motel rooms, so it became the Dutch Sisters Inn. When we first talked about having this little coffee shop, my father, who really had quite a wit, came up with the idea to call it the Dutch Sisters. We were 3 girls, my eldest sister Greta and my younger sister Elizabeth and myself. And he used to say, well, the Pennsylvanian Dutch weren't Dutch either, they were really German. Considering that it was really only 5 years after the war had ended, it was much better than calling it the German Sisters, I think. So we called it the Dutch Sisters, and we actually had quite a motif around that. We used to sell Delft chinaware, and we had little spoons made with the logo, which was the picture of the 3 girls. So it became really well known, and most people thought we were Dutch, and we would just smile and say, well, we weren't really. At one point, Monarch Flour approached my mother about some of her recipes, and she was actually quoted, and there was a big ad in one of the local newspapers. I think it actually was in Maclean's magazine as well, and it was her recipe for Kugelhupf, talking about using Monarch flour. Mother died in 1958, and so my sisters and I were left running the restaurant. I was there until 1960. By 1968, the whole lakeshore area was changing greatly. Unfortunately, the motels were not as popular. The Queen Elizabeth Way had come through, and people couldn't get to the lakeshore quite as easily, and there were a lot more places for people to stay. So in 1968, we decided to sell the restaurant. The motel part and the original home stayed, and it was taken over by a group, and it became the Casa Mendoza.
Unfortunately, this area began a slow and sad period of decline. And the areas, the little places where Ma, Pa, the kids, and Rover would stop along the shore became something quite different. It had a seedier feel to it.
The province in the 1980s approved a plan, and that plan included removing the motels, replacing it with residential, primarily condominiums, and adding a street between condominiums and the lake called Marine Parade Drive, and parkland all along the waterfront.
And what we have now, after the Casa Mendoza closed and the Shore Breeze was boarded up, these areas succumbed to the buildings, the very tall buildings of concrete and glass that overlook the lake. The Shore Breeze Motel was the first of the modern motels in the Humber Bay district. And interestingly enough, it was one of the last to remain. It escaped destruction until just a few short years ago. And during those years, it remained quite a respectable establishment. When the Casa Mendoza closed in 2011, it marked the end of an era for the lakeshore.
Recently, Humber Bay's waterfront was renamed Humber Bay Shores, and names like the Shore Breeze, Palace Motel, and Beach Motel have been replaced by condos with names like South Beach and Ocean Club. The development of new parks over the last few decades means the waterfront, though changed, can still be enjoyed.
Humber Bay today still remains a place that is situated between two rivers. It's defined by its geography, and it looks out to its great expanse of lake. And that's really the one constant in all the change.